Why would a landlocked republic famous for its legions suddenly risk everything on the sea? Why would a people with no tradition of naval warfare take on the mightiest navy in the Western Mediterranean? To understand why Rome fought Carthage at Lilybaeum and how the Roman Republic shattered an empire built on the waves, we need to step back into one of the most decisive struggles of the ancient world, the First Punic War. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, the Western Mediterranean was a patchwork of power. To the north, the Italian peninsula, newly consolidated by Rome after centuries of brutal wars with Etruscans, Samnites, and Greeks. To the south and west, the merchant oligarchy of Carthage, wealthy, seafaring, and utterly dominant at sea. These were two titans with completely different strengths, staring at one another across the narrow waters of Sicily. That island was the jewel of the Mediterranean, fertile, defensible, and positioned at the crossroads of east and west. Whoever held Sicily would control trade, security, and influence over the entire Central Sea. The collision was inevitable, but few could have predicted how brutal and drawn out it would become. Nearly a quarter of a century, the First Punic War raged longer than most people's adult lives. And it was at the city of Lilybaeum, on Sicily's western edge, that the struggle would prove decisive. Lilybaeum wasn't just a city. It was Carthage's anchor on Sicily, a fortress built with thick walls rising nearly 30 meters, a deep harbor protected by breakwaters and garrisons of soldiers drawn from across the Carthaginian Empire. Numidian cavalry, Iberian mercenaries, Punic aristocrats. The defenders were experienced warriors with the strongest maritime empire in the Western world behind them. Rome, by contrast, had almost nothing to recommend it at sea. For centuries, the Republic's strength lay in its legions, columns of citizen soldiers who fought as heavy infantry on land. Rome was a farmer-soldier society. Its fleet consisted of a few ships used to patrol against piracy and assist coastal trade. Against Carthage's hundreds of sleek, expertly sailed war galleys, manned by crews who had been trained for generations, Rome should have been hopeless. And yet, in an astonishing twist, Rome built an entire navy from scratch, copied and reverse-engineered. Carthaginian quinqueremes invented new naval tactics, and by sheer weight of discipline, courage, and determination, met Carthage head-on. The stakes could not have been higher. For Carthage, Sicily was life itself, the breadbasket and trading hub that fueled its economy. For Rome, conquering Sicily meant transforming from a landlocked Italian power into something far greater, an empire across the sea. Consider the psychological gamble involved. No Roman citizen before this generation had commanded great fleets. No Roman had been taught the art of tacking into the wind, of maneuvering lines of warships, of using rams to shatter enemy hulls. To the Romans, sailors were suspicious men, foreigners often viewed as less disciplined than infantry. Yet the Republic's Senate voted to build more than 100 war galleys at once. How shocking must that have sounded to veteran senators, who had spent their lives trusting in the legions. And the Romans didn't stop there. They didn't intend to fight like Carthaginians. They invented a new weapon, the corvus boarding ramp, which transformed every naval battle into a land battle fought on wooden decks. This was Rome at its most brilliant. Innovation through necessity, transforming weakness into an advantage. For the Carthaginian sailors, this was an abomination. To them, naval warfare was about skill, the delicate dance of triremes and quinqueremes maneuvering at sea, the art of ramming, shearing, and retreating. But the Romans reduced it all to one simple formula: get close, drop the boarding bridge, and let legionaries do what they did best, kill at close quarters. This was the essence of the Roman mindset. They didn't accept disadvantages. They didn't resign themselves to their weaknesses. They studied their enemies, learned quickly, and then turned every fight into the kind of war they knew how to win. At Lilybaeum, this would be put to the ultimate test. But before we get to the thunder of rams hitting hulls and the screams of men choked by seawater, let's grasp just how high the stakes were. Rome had never before fought an enemy outside Italy. Sicily was Rome's first provincial conquest, the opening gambit of empire. Carthage, on the other hand, had dominated western seas for centuries. Their empire was wealthy from silver mines in Spain, fertile estates in North Africa, and vast shipping networks stretching all the way to Iberia and even Britain. A Roman failure in Sicily would have been more than a military defeat. It would have locked Rome back into the Italian peninsula forever, forever trapped in the shadow of Punic power. And it wasn't just politics or money. This was personal. Carthage relied heavily on mercenaries, foreign troops who fought for pay. Rome relied on citizen soldiers. Every defeat meant Roman fathers, brothers, and sons were dying in shocking numbers. We have estimates that over 100,000 Roman citizens were lost to storms and naval battles during this war. That's nearly 10% of Rome's adult male population at the time. Entire families extinguished in a single season. To fight this, war was to risk the very survival of the Republic. Imagine being a Roman senator in 250 BCE. You've already buried relatives from the Samnite Wars. You stand in the forum, watching coffins carried in, hearing the cries of mothers mourning sons drowned at sea. The treasury is nearly drained, the farmers are restless, and the gods themselves seem to mock your fleets with storms and disaster. Would you continue? Would you pour more lives into Sicily? Or would you cut your losses, sue for peace, and let Carthage keep its supremacy across the sea? Rome's answer changed the world. At Lilybaeum, Rome refused retreat, even as its fleets were dashed to pieces by storms, even as commanders bungled maneuvers and were dragged back to Rome in disgrace, even as entire legions were swallowed by the Sicilian mud. Rome came back, again and again, rebuilding fleets from scratch, recruiting new armies, and tightening the noose around Lilybaeum. It was here that the Republic demonstrated its most terrifying quality, its sheer refusal to accept defeat. This is why Lilybaeum matters. It wasn't just a siege. It was a crucible, a test of two civilizations, two military traditions, two visions of what domination of the Mediterranean should mean. And at the center of it all, ordinary soldiers and sailors, sweating on the decks, hauling oars, clinging to siege towers, living and dying by the decisions of their leaders. The story of Lilybaeum is one of dramatic contrasts. Rome's stubborn amateurism against Carthage's professional seamanship. Rome's citizen levies clashing with hired mercenaries, Rome's ingenuity in converting a naval war into infantry slaughter. And within those contrasts, you'll see the seeds of something far larger, the rise of the Roman Empire itself. So, as we set sail into the story of this battle, ask yourself, if you were a Roman senator, bleeding men and coin into this endless war, would you have carried on? Or would you have sued for peace, leaving Carthage to rule the waves? Consider that choice carefully, because Rome made its decision, and that decision changed history. The legions had already proven themselves countless times on land, but Sicily, this rich island bristling with fortresses, demanded something new. To conquer it, Rome would have to construct something it had never truly possessed before. A navy that could match the greatest seafaring empire of its age. The question was not merely whether Rome could win battles at sea. The question was whether Rome could become something more than it had ever been before. Unknown to the Roman commanders arriving at Lilybaeum, their enemy was watching, waiting, and planning to prove that the sea would forever remain Carthage's domain. Why did Rome's legions, born on the Italian hillsides, become feared across the ancient world? How could citizen farmers, summoned from their fields each campaign season, evolve into the most relentless military system in history? To understand why Rome shattered Carthage's navy, we must step first onto the ground where Rome's military genius was forged, among the ranks of its legions. The Roman army was not merely a collection of soldiers. It was a machine, rigidly structured, endlessly disciplined, designed to grind down its enemies until nothing remained. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had perfected the manipular legion, a fighting force unlike any other of its age. Unlike the Rigid Greek phalanx which moved and struck as a single dense wall of shields and spears, the Roman legion was a living grid of smaller tactical units. Think of it as blocks on a chessboard. 3 lines deep, each made up of cohorts and maniples, capable of moving, wheeling, and reinforcing one another at will. At the front stood the young hastati, armed with javelins and short swords. Behind them, the older, more seasoned principes, ready to step in once the first line had tired. And lastly, the triarii, veterans holding long spears, were the final reserve, the Roman equivalent of a steel trap springing shut at the moment of crisis. It was this system of depth and flexibility that made Roman armies so terrifying. Unlike the single blow of a phalanx charge, Rome could attack in waves, adapt mid-battle, and preserve resilience even after setbacks. And at the heart of their equipment lay Rome's signature weapon, the gladius. Short, brutal, and designed for stabbing rather than slashing, the gladius transformed Roman combat into a butcher's art. Each thrust delivered in tight formation was lethal, and because the legions trained constantly to fight as one, the gladius became an extension of collective willpower. Behind the gladius came the pilum, a heavy javelin with a soft iron shaft that bent on impact, making it useless to throw back. This was more than a weapon. It was psychological warfare. The pilum shattered enemy shields, disorganized lines, and robbed foes of confidence before the clash even began. But weapons alone don't explain Rome's success. What made the Roman machine unstoppable was its discipline. Training was savage. Punishments were cruel. A legion that broke rank could face decimation. Every 10th man executed in front of his comrades as a warning. Fear didn't merely bind Rome's soldiers, it welded them into a single fighting organism. Young recruits, often farmers straight, from the fields, were drilled endlessly in marching shield drills and mock combat. The rhythm of the legion was pounded into them until obedience became reflex. And yet, there was motivation beyond fear. Roman citizens took pride in their service. Victory meant glory, land, spoils, and a share of Rome's expanding wealth. Failure meant dishonor, not just for the individual soldier, but for his entire family line. Thus, every man marched with both, fear and ambition pushing him forward. This tension, between terror of punishment and longing for renown, was the crucible of legionary morale. So what does this have to do with naval combat? Everything. Because when Rome entered the First Punic War, it had almost no naval tradition. Its sailors were amateurs, its fleets newly built, its commanders largely ignorant of the arts of the sea. On paper, this was hopeless. And yet, when faced with Carthage's vast advantage in seamanship, Rome decided not to fight on Carthage's terms. The Republic applied its core principle: adapt the situation to fit the legion, not the other way around. The instrument of this adaptation was the corvus. Picture a massive wooden boarding bridge, spiked with an iron hook on its underside. As Roman ships closed with Carthaginian galleys, the bridge swung down with a thunderous crash, locking onto the enemy deck. Suddenly, the fight no longer depended on oarsmen maneuvering in elegant lines. Now it was a land battle at sea, Romans storming across the corvus in tight formation, gladii stabbing, pila thrown from above. Carthaginian captains, masters of ramming tactics, suddenly found their elegant maneuvers useless against an enemy who didn't care about naval grace. Strategically, this was stunning. Within only a few years, Rome transformed what should have been its greatest weakness into a strength. No sailor could outmaneuver Carthage in open water, but legionaries could outfight them once decks were boarded. In one stroke, Rome neutralized centuries of Punic seamanship. Consider the psychological effect. For generations, the Carthaginians had believed themselves unrivaled at sea. They had grown up on ships, their economy tied to wind and wave, their culture steeped in maritime traditions, centuries old. To see raw Roman citizens, landlubbers, suddenly leaping onto their decks and cutting down veteran sailors in disciplined formations must have been shocking. It was as if a novice chess player had suddenly turned the chessboard into a sword fight, completely rewriting the rules of the contest. But Rome's military machine wasn't just about tactics, it was about logistics. For every fleet lost in storms, and Rome lost many, the Senate called upon its citizens and allies to build more. Wealthy aristocrats funded the reconstruction of entire squadrons. Farmers provided manpower year after year, filling the ranks regardless of losses. Rome could bleed more than Carthage because its system was built upon the inexhaustible manpower of central Italy. Carthage, tied to mercenaries and hired crews, could not so easily replace its losses. This contrast of manpower systems mattered deeply at Lilybaeum. Every Roman loss was tragic, but every Roman death brought another citizen to hunger for revenge. Every Punic mercenary slain, however, was a drain on Carthage's treasury, each defeat requiring more coin, not more patriotism, to restore. Over the long war of attrition, this imbalance would tilt the scales. Let's pause and consider leadership. A Roman consul or praetor was expected to lead in person, standing on the deck, rallying men, sharing risks. It was part of the civic identity of the Republic. Carthaginian admirals, often elites appointed by the oligarchic council, sometimes delegated heavily to subordinates. For Rome, this created a kind of gritty camaraderie, commanders who lived and died with their men, and it gave them advantages when morale wavered. One of the first examples came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, where Gaius Duilius, an otherwise unremarkable Roman consul, achieved what no one thought possible. His newly trained navy, equipped with corvi, smashed aside the Carthaginians in open battle. Duilius returned to Rome as a hero. His exploits were so unexpected, so shocking that a column was erected in his honor, adorned with the prows of captured ships. Every evening thereafter, he was escorted home by slaves holding torches and playing flutes, a nightly reminder that Rome, landlocked Rome, had beaten Carthage at sea. This moment was more than personal glory. It was a signal to the Republic that discipline, not tradition, would decide the war. Of course, Rome would suffer humiliating disasters. At times the war seemed cursed. Entire fleets, hundreds of ships, were swallowed by storms in sudden squalls. Tens of thousands of men drowned without a single blow struck by the enemy. Roman arrogance in relying on corvi made ships top-heavy and unstable, increasing the risk of capsizing. Yet each time fleets sank beneath the waves, new fleets were raised. It was the machine's relentlessness, not its perfection, that terrified enemies. This relentless system, discipline, adaptation, logistics, citizen sacrifice, was the essence of Rome's military machine. Lilybaeum would soon prove to be the eye-testing ground of whether that system could endure the longest and most brutal trial of all. Now imagine the pressure on the men in those ships. A farmer from Latium, seated at an oar, drenched in salt spray. He doesn't know how to steer, doesn't trust the sea, can barely sleep for fear of storms. Yet as soon as the corvus slams down, he transforms into what he was trained to be. A soldier of the Republic, stabbing with gladius, advancing step by step with shield up, drive unbroken. This transformation, ordinary men into the edge of empire, was what made Rome so dangerous. Consider, as you hear this, a strategic question of your own. You are a Roman consul, commanding a fleet of amateurs against Carthage's veteran sailors. Do you risk maneuvering, fighting on their terms, trusting seamanship you don't possess? Or do you gamble on an untested invention, turning the naval fight into a brutal melee? Rome chose the gamble, and in that gamble lay the seeds of empire. The story of Lilybaeum will demonstrate how far Rome could stretch its military system, how stubbornly it could endure losses, and how thoroughly it could reshape the rules of war. But first, we must see this system tested in the crucible of Sicily, where siege towers, trenches, rams, and fleets would converge in one of the war's defining struggles. Why did Rome pour year after year of men, ships, and treasure into the walls of Lilybaeum? Why did Carthage cling to that city with such ferocity, even as fleets drowned in storms and mercenaries plotted mutiny. To understand the struggle for Sicily, we must place ourselves on the windswept promontory of the island's western tip, where the great fortress of Lilybaeum stood as both prize and prison for decades of war. By 250 BCE, the First Punic War had already consumed more than a decade and offered no clear victor. Rome had won its early naval gamble at Mylae, suffered catastrophic losses in storms, rebuilt, fought again, and yet Sicily remained unresolved. Carthage, though still the master of seafaring, had failed to eject the dogged Romans from the island. Both powers looked at Lilybaeum as the fulcrum. The city's harbors were capacious, its walls vast and solid, its garrison hardened by mercenary experience. For Carthage it meant survival, and for Rome it was the key to choking Punic power at its root. The Romans threw everything into this fortress. 100,000 men are said to have crossed to Sicily, accompanied by siege towers that groaned under their own weight, rams hewn from whole forests, and fleets positioned to cut off Lilybaeum's twin harbors. If the city fell, Carthage would be cut away from Sicily, its scattered strongholds isolated and doomed. But the Carthaginians were no passive defenders. Inside the city walls stood commanders and mercenaries willing to employ every stratagem possible, and outside, across the sea, Carthaginian admirals prepared to run supply missions into the jaws of Roman fleets. The siege began with confidence. In the Roman camp, trenches tightened around the fortress. Towers crawled closer to the gates. At sea, Roman quinqueremes lined up like a steel and oak barrier. But almost immediately that confidence was tested. The Carthaginian fleet had an edge in experience, and in the first months, daring blockade runners slipped through the Roman cordon. Ancient sources describe their audacity. Sails furled to hide from watchtowers, oars muffled in the night, pilots using tides and shoals invisible to Roman eyes. By dawn, they were inside Lilybaeum's harbors, unloading sacks of grain and barrels of weapons to sustain the defenders. For the Romans, it was humiliating. Here were farmers turned sailors, trying to cut off the most experienced maritime power in the West. The contrast must have been galling, legionaries aware that their dignity depended not only on bravery with a shield and sword, but on sailors' skills they did not yet master. Every successful blockade run stabbed at Roman pride and reminded them that even with overwhelming numbers, they could not yet choke Carthage's lifeline. And then disaster struck their siege works. Days and weeks of construction created enormous towers that loomed against Lilybaeum's walls. The Romans prepared to move these slow giants forward, hoping to batter down defenses with sheer mass. But a daring Carthaginian raid undid all of it. One evening, mercenary soldiers burst out from hidden postern gates and hurled fire at the towers. Roman sentries were cut down, engineers scattered, and within moments the wooden engines were engulfed in flames. The night sky flared red, illuminating, thousands of soldiers watching their labor consumed. The catastrophe was more than material. It was psychological. An entire strategy had gone up in smoke. The Romans were reminded that their enemy was clever, unpredictable, and still commanded initiative. But the Republic's war machine was not built on delicacy. Towers could burn, new towers would rise, ramps could collapse, new ones would be built. Rome's genius was not in avoiding loss, but in absorbing it. Soldiers groaned, rebuilt, and dragged forward replacements. Siege warfare became endless labor. Trenches, counter-trenches, bridges, rams, all repeated in cycles. If Carthage could match with daring, Rome would answer with persistence. Then came Carthage's boldest moment. Admiral Adherbal, aware that the survival of Lilybaeum required more than sporadic supply runs, gambled everything on a massive relief attempt. With over 100 vessels weighted with food and reinforcements, he hurled his convoy directly into the supposed Roman blockade. Galleys slashed through enemy lines, ramming when necessary, evading when possible. Against all probability, admirals smashed through and delivered vast stores inside the city. It was a feat celebrated in Punic memory for generations. More than tactical brilliance, it was strategic salvation. That single convoy bought Lilybaeum years of endurance and turned Rome's hopes of quick victory into stagnant frustration. Meanwhile, tensions inside Lilybaeum reflected Carthage's chronic weakness. Dependence on mercenaries. These Iberian and Celtic warriors were fierce in battle but hungry for pay. As months grew into years, discipline inside the city frayed. Mercenaries extorted civilians, brawled among themselves, threatened mutiny. Accounts from contemporaries tell of mercenaries controlling food rationing to fatten their purses. Carthage struggled constantly to balance their loyalty, for without them, Lilybaeum would collapse from within. The Romans, too, suffered. Men rotted in damp camps, fevers spread, and morale waned as another campaigning season ended with no decisive breakthrough. Sicily's landscape itself became hostile. Heat, dust, and the endless monotony of waiting turned the siege into a trial of patience, not just courage. Archaeological finds of hastily dug graves near Lilybaeum testify to this attrition. War was killing men silently, through disease and exhaustion, as much as through steel. As the siege dragged on, the Senate's frustration grew. Commanders rotated annually, bringing fresh ambition but also division. Some believed Rome should assault relentlessly, others counseled caution. The dynamic mirrored Rome's political system itself, where consuls sought glory but operated under the fickle expectations of the people. In contrast, Carthage invested authority in skilled admirals who knew the sea intimately, but undermined them with constant disputes in the oligarchic council. Thus, both sides operated under political chains. Rome's constant churn of leadership, Carthage's factionalism, and mercenary reliance. Despite all of this, Lilybaeum did not fall. Time after time, Rome's attempts were frustrated. Blockades broken, towers destroyed, mercenaries placated, supplies replenished. It became one of the longest sieges in antiquity. The city's walls remained unbroken, but Rome also refused. Any hint of withdrawal, a duel of attrition ground on, more stubborn than spectacular, more grinding than glorious. But as stalemate deepened, pressure for decisive action mounted, which brings us to one of Rome's most notorious debacles. In 249 BCE, consul Publius Claudius Pulcher, exasperated at the lack of progress, sought to end the war at a stroke. Rather than continuing sluggish operations around Lilybaeum, he turned to neighboring Drepana, where Carthage's fleet anchored. A bold night assault might catch them off guard and achieve the sea victory Rome desperately craved. But Pulcher faced an omen he chose to scorn. Livy and others tell us that the sacred chickens, consulted for divine approval, refused to eat. A bad sign. Defiant, Pulcher hurled them into the waves, scoffing, "If they won't eat, let them drink." The jest would be remembered for centuries. His fleet blundered against a superior Carthaginian admiral, and disaster followed. 93 Roman ships were lost in the ensuing battle at Drepana. Thousands of sailors killed or captured. It was a humiliation of staggering proportions. Lilybaeum had proven unconquerable, and now external gambles ended in catastrophe. Pulcher returned to Rome disgraced, facing scandal and trial. Yet here again is the defining Roman quality. Even this catastrophe did not end their war. Though the siege stagnated, though consular pride had brought ruin, Rome refused to abandon Lilybaeum. They left a permanent force to hem it in year after year, to keep the garrison contained and bleeding. The Republic seemed to have internalized one principle, that any defeat could be endured, that persistence itself was a weapon sharper than iron. Lilybaeum thus stands not as a tale of one side's triumph, but as a profound symbol of endurance. It was Carthage at its boldest, blockade-running skill, mercenary daring, naval audacity. It was Rome at its most stubborn, rebuilding after humiliation, pressing forward even in stalemate. Neither would win outright, but in that grinding deadlock, The wider fate of the war was already taking shape. Carthage could keep a fortress alive, but it could not match Rome's capacity to hurl fresh men into the struggle endlessly. Only time, coin, and blood decided such contests, and in all three, Rome eventually outlasted. If you were a Carthaginian admiral watching Rome rebuild fleets after each storm, train new crews after every defeat, fund fresh campaigns after every humiliation, would you not begin to suspect that you were facing something unprecedented? Would you not wonder if only annihilation could suffice against such an enemy? It was here, in the long stalemate of Lilybaeum, that Hamilcar Barca began to form that suspicion. He fought with skill near the city, harried Roman forces, and concluded that Rome's stubbornness was unlike anything Carthage had yet known. His son Hannibal would carry that lesson in his heart, across the Alps, believing that Rome must be crushed utterly, or Rome would never fall. Lilybaeum did not yield quickly, nor did Rome falter. Instead, it dragged on, year after year, until both sides were exhausted. Yet amid the stalemate, destiny shifted. For as the Romans brooded over the humiliation at Drepana, they prepared, once again, to gamble with the sea. The turning point of the First Punic War was coming, and with it, a calamity that would nearly break the Republic before it rose again stronger. Why did a single moment of arrogance tip the balance at sea, plunging Rome into disaster, shaking the very confidence of its people? How could one consul's rash gamble bring humiliation upon a system that prided itself on discipline and restraint? The story of the turning point in the war for Sicily begins not inside the walls of Lilybaeum, but just offshore, in the restless waters at Drepana. By 249 BCE, the Romans had battered and bled themselves against the city of Lilybaeum for years, without decisive results. Siege towers had burned, blockades had been broken, and Carthaginian admirals continued to slip through. Inside the Senate, questions burned hotter than any Sicilian sun. Why, after pouring out so much manpower and treasure, had Sicily not yielded? Rome's citizens demanded victory. Roman allies, pressed for ships and men, pleaded for an end to this bleeding war. The consuls for that year would need to prove that their leadership could shift the stalemate. One of them, Publius Claudius Pulcher, was a man known as much for arrogance as ambition. Born into one of Rome's great patrician families, he carried ancient prestige in his name, but his own talents did not match his pride. Pulcher saw in the war not just a chance to serve the Republic, but to immortalize himself. If he could smash Carthage's navy in one decisive blow, glory, not merely honor, would be his. And so, with Lilybaeum stubbornly holding, he turned, his sights to the Carthaginian fleet anchored at the nearby harbor of Drepana. Imagine his reasoning. Carthaginian ships huddled there, he believed, vulnerable to a surprise strike. If he could fall upon them swiftly by night, trap them against their own coast, Rome would obliterate Carthage's mastery of the sea. It was the bold, audacious move of a commander reaching for eternal triumph. But boldness is no substitute for wisdom. Before launching, he consulted Rome's sacred rituals, as was custom. Priests brought forward the sacred chickens whose eating was a sign of divine favor. If they consumed their meal eagerly, the gods smiled upon the undertaking, but the chickens refused to eat, a grim omen. Pulcher, contemptuous of religion when it clashed with his ambition, sneered. According to tradition, he seized the birds and hurled them into the sea, quipping, "If they will not eat, then let them drink." What seemed clever in that moment would echo in scorn for centuries. For Romans, flouting the gods before battle was more than hubris. It was madness. Whether divine wrath or human ineptitude, catastrophe swiftly followed. Pulcher led his fleet in darkness toward Drepana, hoping to surprise the anchored Carthaginians. But dawn betrayed him. His ships straggled along the coast, in stretched formation, discipline lost in confusion. The Carthaginian admiral Adherbal, swift to react, did not wait to be trapped. With the confidence of seasoned sailors, he sailed his fleet straight out of the harbor, maneuvering into open water where their superior seamanship could decide the contest. The result was carnage. Roman commanders, trained to rely on the corvus, boarding bridge, to neutralize Punic maneuvering, discovered too late that their invention betrayed them. The corvus made each quinquereme dangerously unstable, top-heavy in rough water. Against Carthaginians maneuvering with precision in open sea, Roman vessels became plodding hulks. Ramming attacks shattered hulls. Oars splintered. Roman ships, unable to coordinate, found themselves engulfed. Consul Pulcher's dream of glory dissolved into chaos and blood. 93 Roman ships were lost, a staggering portion of the fleet, along with tens of thousands of drowned or captured crewmen. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman naval history. Consider for a moment what it meant. A republic priding itself on discipline, on obedience to religious ritual, had just suffered disaster directly after its commander mocked the gods. Every sailor who survived must have whispered that Rome had been cursed by sacrilege. Pulcher crawled back to Rome not as a hero but as a national disgrace. Livy and later historians delight in the tale of his chickens precisely to emphasize the moral, that arrogance, irreverence, and contempt for order met divine and human punishment. Pulcher faced trial upon his return, publicly shamed, and his name became a lesson to any who would confuse personal ambition with Rome's survival. Yet Rome's disasters were not over. The second consul of that year, Lucius Junius Pullus, was tasked with salvaging Rome's position. With another fleet, he too sought to move supplies and reinforce the weary forces surrounding Lilybaeum. But as if fate itself had turned against the Republic, his convoy met sudden storms. Entire squadrons were obliterated by the fury of Neptune. Ship after ship capsized, timber splintered, men swallowed by raging seas. The casualty lists stretched into the tens of thousands. Between Pulcher's defeat at Drepana and Pullus's losses in the storm, nearly 2 entire Roman navies were destroyed in the same fateful year. Rome seemed cursed. Carthage, triumphant, could boast that the sea itself protected their empire. Sicilian towns loyal to Rome wavered. Allies questioned whether this war was winnable. Had Rome's experiment with naval power finally met its limit? But here we see Rome at its most paradoxical. Any other state might have sued for peace. Any other people, having lost over 100,000 men to storms, battle, and disease, might have surrendered their ambitions. But not Rome. It is here that their most terrifying quality emerges, the refusal to admit defeat, however unbearable the losses. Blame was heaped upon Pulcher, sacrifices to the gods renewed, funds raised once again. Allies were pressed to provide more crews. Slaves were even manned on ships and promised freedom for faithful service. Rome, in essence, attempted to drown Carthage not with skill, but with unrelenting national will. Meanwhile, in Carthage, confidence and uncertainty mixed. Adherbal had delivered a brilliant victory at Drepana, the kind that any admiral would hope to achieve once in a lifetime. The city celebrated. Merchants poured offerings to Baal Hammon, and for the first time in many years it seemed the tide had turned completely. But Carthage made a crucial error. They squandered their advantage. Their oligarchic council hesitated, arguing about costs, unsure whether to pour more silver into further conquests. Unlike Rome, they did not exploit the victory ruthlessly. Instead of sweeping over Sicily with renewed strength, they allowed the war to drag on. Inside Lilybaeum, the mercenaries still guarded the walls, but unrest persisted. Payment was irregular, trust fragile. Hamilcar Barca began to make his presence felt, launching a campaign of smaller, sharper engagements near the city, harassing Roman camps, refusing open battle, but grinding their endurance. It was a style that foreshadowed Hannibal's brilliance to come: asymmetric warfare, mobility, and constant pressure on a larger enemy. But even Hamilcar could not deliver decisive relief. Thus, the turning point of 249 BCE was not decisive in ending the war, but decisive in reshaping its nature. Drepana shattered the illusion that Rome could quickly force the issue through naval surprise. The storms confirmed that over-reliance on corvée and clumsy seamanship carried mortal risks. Rome was knocked low in morale and resources, forced to reckon with the weaknesses of its naval machine. Carthage basked in triumph, but its political divisions meant that the window to annihilate Roman presence on Sicily was squandered. Consider for yourself. If you were a Roman senator that year, sitting in the Curia with news of disaster after disaster, would you have voted to pour more resources into the war? Or would you have urged negotiation, an end to the bleeding? Most nations would have chosen the latter. But Rome did not. They recognized, perhaps more instinctively than their enemies, that failure is only permanent if accepted. So ships were built again, men levied again, silver collected again. They had endured humiliations before, and time and again had risen stronger. Carthage may have won Drepana, but Rome won something less visible and more enduring. The reputation among both allies and enemies that the Republic could not be intimidated into surrender. This is the paradox of the turning point. Drepana was Rome's defeat, yet it was also proof of Carthage's greatest weakness, inability to press advantage. And Lilybaeum, though battered, remained all the while in stalemate. Carthage had humiliated its enemy, but it had not broken the siege completely. Rome staggered but did not retreat. Both sides bled, but one side bled willingly, endlessly, remorselessly. What begins here at Drepana is not simply a reversal in one year's campaigning, but the slow revelation of character. Carthage brilliant, in the moment, stunning in naval prowess, daring in sudden raids. Rome patient, stubborn, prodigal with lives, even foolish in losses, yet monstrously resilient. These traits would define not just the outcome of the First Punic War, but the destiny of the Mediterranean for centuries. Thus, the turning point at Drepana, despite delivering glory to Carthage and disgrace to Pulcher, did not secure victory. It revealed something far more fateful, that Rome's will could sustain catastrophe without collapse, while Carthage's triumph could not grow into domination. The lesson was carved in the bodies of drowned sailors and the broken planks of fleets at the bottom of Sicilian seas. Rome had been checked, humiliated, tested, but not defeated. And as the stalemate around Lilybaeum stretched further, another truth began to harden. This war would not be won by swift sieges or daring sorties. It would be a war decided by exhaustion, by attrition, by which society could endure 23 years of bleeding longer than the other. Already the answer to that question was beginning to show. Rome stumbled at Drepana, but Carthage failed to kill. And no predator should ever wound what it does not have the courage to finish. Why does the struggle at Lilybaeum matter? Why should we care about a stubborn Sicilian city, an arrogant consul with his drowned chickens, or fleets dashed against rocks by storms 2,000 years ago? Because in this drawn-out contest, Rome's character revealed itself, and that character reshaped the world. The first consequence was the sheer scale of loss. Over 100,000 Roman citizens and allies perished at sea during the First Punic War. No other event in Rome's early history came close. To put this in perspective, it was as though every adult male of a generation in a mid-sized city simply vanished beneath the waves. Entire families were extinguished. Sons who should have inherited farms drowned together in galleys built only months before. Mothers stood in the forum waiting for news, only to hear that an entire fleet had disappeared in the night. Carthage certainly inflicted terrible wounds, but nature itself seemed to fight on their side. Storms destroyed more Romans than Punic rams ever could. And yet, that is precisely the point. Rome endured. No defeat, however colossal, ever pushed the Republic into permanent retreat. When fleets were lost, the Senate ordered new shipbuilding programs. Citizens volunteered wealth to finance vessels. Aristocrats funded squadrons out of private fortunes. We know of entire groups of nobles who sponsored ships and outfitted them at their own expense, not out of mercy, but because the Republic's collective will demanded no interruption. Carthage marveled, and perhaps despaired at this. How could a people so inexperienced at sea absorb catastrophe after catastrophe and still try again? The answer lay in social structure. Rome tapped into the inexhaustible manpower of Italy. Every allied community, Samnites, Etruscans, Campanians, owed soldiers and sailors. Defeat meant grief, but it also rallied determination, because Rome's network of allies saw their own independence tied to Roman strength. Carthage, by contrast, relied heavily on hired mercenaries and professional crews. Losses had to be repaid in coin, and coin eventually runs dry. The war, therefore, revealed a flaw at the heart of Carthaginian power. A great naval machine, but one dependent on mercenary loyalty and financial stability. Even within the siege itself, the long-term shift became visible. Carthage's mercenaries grew fractious. Their loyalty was transactional. Rome's citizen soldiers, whatever their misery, did not abandon the lines. They suffered corruption, poor rations, storms and diseases, but their identity was bound to the Republic's cause. This split between citizen army and mercenary host began to tell. The memory of Sicily laid the foundations for what would later erupt as the mercenary war in Africa, when Carthage's unpaid soldiers turned against their own masters. Lilybaeum foreshadowed that collapse. Another major consequence was intellectual. Rome had entered the war as a land power with no naval tradition. 23 years later, it emerged as a state not only accustomed to naval combat, but profoundly dependent on it. This was revolutionary. The Mediterranean was no longer Carthage's lake. Roman senators grappled with strategy across waters for the first time. They learned the value of maritime supply chains, the vulnerability of coastal settlements to sudden raids, the importance of storm seasons and harbors. In a single war, Rome transformed from a terrestrial republic into a proto-maritime empire. Without this transformation, Caesar would never later cross into Gaul, nor Augustus dominate Egypt and the East. Lilybaeum was the workshop in which Roman naval power was forged. Archaeology confirms the scale of this leap. Off the coasts of Sicily, divers have recovered dozens of bronze rams torn from galley prows. These heavy fixtures, once adorned with decorations of gods or animals, tell the silent story of brutal ramming collisions. Some bear inscriptions of Roman names, others Punic. Many still carry wood fragments fused to their sockets, proof that they were torn from wrecks when ships went down. They are the skeletal remains of the First Punic War, physical echoes of Lilybaeum's struggle preserved beneath the waves. Each recovered ram represents a ship lost, hundreds of lives ended, thousands of families bereft. And yet, taken together, they speak most clearly of Rome's commitment to build again after every loss. The war's human cost created consequences for Roman society at home as well. So many citizen soldiers died that small farms fell fallow. Entire patches of Italy saw shifts in land ownership. Aristocratic families, less affected by military levies, absorbed abandoned plots, beginning a process that would, generations later, transform Italy into an economy dominated by great estates worked by slaves. Thus, Lilybaeum indirectly contributed to social tensions that erupted during the late Republic. What looked like short-term resilience hid a long-term imbalance, one that would ultimately corrode the Republic from within. Carthage, for its part, emerged from Lilybaeum, and the wider war weakened in ways not immediately obvious. On the surface, Carthage had survived. Lilybaeum had not fallen, its fleet had triumphed at Drepana. But by 241 BCE, the strain became unbearable. Finances were drained, mercenary contracts stretched thin, and strategic initiative had shifted to Rome. When the Carthaginian fleet was finally defeated at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, it was not because its sailors lacked skill, but because the city could no longer sustain the scale of the struggle. Rome had rebuilt yet again, fielding a fleet funded by private contributions and manned with desperate determination. The difference between a republic bound together by civic identity and an empire reliant on money became decisive. From the peace terms that followed, everything changed. Sicily was surrendered to Rome. For the first time, the Republic held territory beyond Italy's peninsula. Sicily became Rome's first province, governed by magistrates sent with imperium, its resources flowing into Roman coffers. This was unprecedented. Before Lilybaeum, Rome had fought to dominate Italy. After Lilybaeum, Rome held lands overseas. You could argue that empire itself was born in the shadow of those stubborn walls. The precedent was vast. Sicily's conquest created a model, a provincial governorship extracting grain, tribute, and manpower to support the Roman state. It also gave Rome a foothold from which to project power into Sardinia, Corsica, and eventually into Africa itself. Without Lilybaeum, there is no Mediterranean empire. Carthage had lost not just an island, but the entire strategic equation of the Central Sea. For military history, the Siege of Lilybaeum stands as a study in attrition. It demonstrates that resilience can be as decisive as brilliance. Carthaginian sailors and mercenaries executed feats of astounding daring, blockade runs, sabotage, victories at sea. But none of it could shatter Roman stubbornness. Rome erred, constantly, lost disastrously, but endured. Carthage triumphed tactically, but failed strategically. The war was decided less by striking blows than by one side's willingness to absorb them eternally. Even for modern leaders, the lessons are clear. Lilybaeum reminds us that overwhelming skill is not always enough. What matters is the political and social capacity to sustain effort over time. Rome's persistence in financing new fleets, in mobilizing citizens despite mourning, in converting humiliation into determination, resembles how modern states wage wars of endurance. Carthage's brilliance but political hesitation resembles powers that can win battles yet lose wars. In the end, Lilybaeum stands as a mirror for the difference between tactical victories and strategic resilience. The consequences also reverberated culturally. For the Romans, the war instilled a self-image as a people chosen by fate to overcome any obstacle. Epic poets glorified the sacrifice, and historians highlighted the almost superhuman capacity of the Republic to survive disaster. For Carthage, the lessons were darker. Lilybaeum bred resentment among mercenaries and deepened rifts within its governing elite. Even their victory at Drepana seemed tainted. Triumph did not lead to dominance. These tensions boiled over soon after in the mercenary war, when Carthage's own unpaid troops turned against them in revolt. This is the paradox. On paper, Carthage could claim more tactical wins at Lilybaeum. At sea, their seamanship was unmatched. On land, their mercenary raids wreaked havoc. Yet the larger consequence was their gradual exhaustion, while Rome, inexplicably, only grew stronger with each collapse. The city of Lilybaeum thus became a crucible not of Punic endurance, but of Roman identity. In its smoke and suffering, Rome forged not only the skill to dominate seas, but the conviction that no enemy, however skilled, could resist forever. We must also acknowledge how the experience shaped the leaders themselves. Hamilcar Barca left. Sicily convinced that Rome could never be fought by half measures. His harassment of Roman lines at Lilybaeum taught him that only audacious strategy could unsettle the Republic's methodical persistence. His young son Hannibal grew up hearing these lessons, formed by the conviction that only annihilation would suffice. The legacy of Lilybaeum thus seeded the future catastrophe of Cannae and the terror of Hannibal's march across Italy. So the consequences of Lilybaeum were enormous and enduring. The war ruined fleets, consumed whole generations, drained treasuries, and shifted social balances. But in the ashes, Rome emerged transformed, now a naval power, now an imperial power, now a state that knew no geographic boundary to its ambitions. Sicily was the first stepping stone. The Mediterranean would follow. Carthage had defended its fortress bravely, but in failing to break Rome, it set in motion its own decline. Think of it. What looked like stalemate at Lilybaeum was in truth history tipping silently forward. The walls that refused to fall were less important than the republic that refused surrender. Out of attrition, empire was born. Why did Carthage squander its advantage after Drepana? Why did Rome, reeling from calamity, still march forward toward victory? The answers are not only on the battlefield, but in the very councils where old men whispered, senators schemed, and generals measured ambition against survival. For the First Punic War was not only a contest of fleets and fortresses, it was a duel of politics. In Rome, the war created a paradox. Victories won men glory, defeats ruined families forever. The Senate chamber became a place not just of strategy, but of trial. Consuls served their one-year terms and then returned to account for every success or failure. After Drepana, Publius Claudius Pulcher found himself crushed not only by military disaster, but by political ritual. His mocking of the sacred chickens practically begged the Senate to sacrifice him as a scapegoat. He escaped execution, but his reputation was destroyed forever. His name remembered not for bravery, but for blasphemy and incompetence. His disgrace spoke loudly to every politician watching. Win and you will be immortalized. Lose and you will be humiliated. This ethos cut both ways. It inspired Roman commanders to pursue glory with desperation, to attempt bold strokes in hopes of carving their names across marble. But it also bred recklessness, as men sought quick victories in the narrow window of a consul's term. The annual churn of leadership prevented long-term planning, leaving sieges like Lilybaeum to drag on as commanders rotated with new visions that clashed with the ones before them. Yet the political system also bound the entire aristocracy to the war. Every year, 2 members of Rome's elite carried commands, and through them the Senate invested its reputation. No one family could abandon the struggle without dishonor. No one politician dared suggest surrender, lest rivals paint him as betrayer of the Republic. Rome's collective ambition to preserve prestige forged political will as strong as legionary iron. Behind the scenes, factions argued over funding. The war's cost in coin was staggering. Raising new fleets emptied treasuries and placed heavy burdens on allied communities. Yet even here, politics worked strangely in Rome's favor. Competition among noble families drove some to finance fleets, privately seeking renown by equipping ships from their own estates. The very hunger for honor that risked disaster on the field became the mechanism by which Rome replenished its forces. Political vanity, so dangerous in battle, was life-saving at the strategic level. For Carthage, politics played out differently and more destructively. The city was a commercial empire, ruled by a wealthy oligarchy of merchant families. Decisions were often driven by financial calculation rather than united national ideology. The Council of Elders debated endlessly, weighing the cost of fleets against profit margins from trade. Victories like those at Drepana were celebrated, but proposals to follow them up with massive new investment met resistance. Why risk more treasure when peace might save coin? Why fund another general when mercenaries could hold the line? This mercantile caution, so rational in a trading city, proved fatal in a war of endurance, and Carthage's reliance on mercenaries shaped everything. For centuries, the Punic army had been composed largely of hired warriors, Numidians famed for their light horse, Iberians with their ferocious swords, Gauls who flung themselves at the enemy with wild abandon. These men fought brilliantly, but loyalty had to be purchased season by season. Salaries delayed triggered mutiny, and in the far reaches of the empire, mercenary captains sometimes acted more like warlords than servants of the city. The Lilybaeum garrison itself teetered on the edge of rebellion more than once, its diverse warriors threatening to sell out if Carthage's gold did not flow. Inside the council, factions battled over how to wage the greater war. One group, represented by Hanno, sometimes called the Great, favored caution. Hanno's vision was one of preserving Carthage's African and Iberian possessions, guarding trade routes, and avoiding ruinous confrontations with Rome. On the other side stood the Barcid faction, led by Hamilcar Barca, who believed victory in Sicily required constant aggression, raids, and the humiliation of Roman armies to sap their morale. The tension between Hanno's conservative caution and Hamilcar's audacity paralyzed Carthage strategically. Where Rome erred through recklessness, Carthage erred through hesitation. Hamilcar himself is worth lingering on. Around Lilybaeum, he became known as a commander of remarkable resourcefulness. With small, mobile forces, he launched raids against Roman supply lines, struck quickly at isolated detachments, and vanished into Sicilian hills before counterattack arrived. He exemplified the asymmetric style: avoid decisive clashes, bleed. The larger enemy, erode their patience. It was a proto-guerrilla style that Roman historians later recalled with grudging respect and dread. In few men can we see the foreshadowing of Hannibal more clearly. The father's habit of harassing Rome wherever possible became the son's creed in Italy decades later. But Hamilcar never received the full support of Carthage's council. They gave him enough resources to trouble Rome, but not enough to destroy them. Carthage could not unite behind his vision, and so his brilliance could never translate into decisive results. The political contrast between Rome and Carthage is stark. Rome's Senate punished failures viciously, but rewarded endurance. Everyone was bound to the collective identity of the Republic. Even catastrophic defeats merely pushed patricians to demand still greater sacrifice. Carthage's council, in contrast, sought prudence. They thought in terms of profit and loss. But in wars of survival, prudence is weakness. While Rome mortgaged its very future for persistence, Carthage trimmed its sails. This imbalance grew more decisive with every passing year of stalemate. The politics of the Punic War were not limited to the two capitals. In Sicily itself, Greek cities hedged their bets. Some, long resentful of Carthaginian overlords, leaned toward Rome. But when Roman fleets sank or Roman consuls blundered, their loyalty faltered. Carthage courted them with gold and promises. Sicily thus became a political chessboard, each side maneuvering not only with rams and javelins, but with bribes and diplomacy. The long war exhausted Sicily's civilians most of all. Farmers lost harvests year after year as armies marched across fields. Local elites struck deals with whichever power seemed strongest that season, and their duplicity only deepened the cynicism in both Rome and Carthage about trusting the island's inhabitants. Add to this the rivalry not between states, but within families. Roman clans measured their honor against one another. A victory could elevate a family for generations, a defeat stain it beyond repair. Pulcher's disgrace echoed down his line. Hamilcar's stubborn resistance elevated the Barca name into a dynasty. Even in failure, politics was generational. Hannibal's future war was waged not simply as Carthaginian duty, but as filial vengeance. To destroy Rome was to complete the task his father had left unfinished. Political intrigue also shaped religion. After Pulcher's sacrilege, Rome became doubly devout. State rituals multiplied, sacrifices increased, and commanders made sure that no campaign launched without proper omens. The image of the consul ignoring the gods haunted senators, convincing them that defeat had been punishment for impiety. Roman politics therefore fused tighter with piety. To be devout was to be patriotic. Carthage, ruled by elites devoted to Baal Hammon and Tanit, also relied heavily on sacrifice, sometimes even, according to Roman accusations, of children during periods of desperation. Whether true or exaggerated, these charges fueled Rome's propaganda, portraying their enemy as both dangerous and impious, strengthening political resolve to wage war without mercy. When we examine the broader arc, it becomes clear. The war's eventual outcome was not just forged by naval clashes or sieges, but by these very intramural contests. Rome's unified stubbornness outlasted Carthage's divided pragmatism. Political systems determined endurance. One republic could adapt and absorb failure because its aristocracy was tied to collective destiny. The other, an oligarchy of merchants, sought to preserve wealth rather than risk it all. The lesson is poignant. In wars of attrition, divided councils are more fatal than enemy weapons. Consider the political cliffhanger this creates. By the end of the 240s BCE, Rome stood battered and impoverished. Its people had endured generations of mourning. Carthage, for all its brilliant naval victories, remained strapped by indecision, its councils reluctant to authorize decisive invasions. Both sides eyed Sicily with exhaustion. Which would break first politically, the Republic, that had nearly destroyed its own population, or the empire clinging nervously to its profits? History gave its answer, but at the time, no one could predict it. If you had been seated in the Carthaginian council, watching treasure vanish into mercenary wages, watching your fleets fight glorious battles, but your war still drag on, would you have voted to double down, to give Hamilcar everything, or would you have counted the coins and sought peace before ruin? That choice defined Carthage's fate. And if you had been a Roman senator, listening to the names of drowned sons, deciding whether to saddle allies with yet another fleet levy, would you have dared to say, "Enough"? Or would you have feared the wrath of your people, who demanded vengeance even through tears? Rome chose to persist, Carthage chose to hesitate. What does a war of attrition lasting a generation do to the fabric of society? Numbers, fleets, and battles tell only part of the story. Behind them stand real people, grappling with exhaustion, sacrifice, and the slow distortion of their lives. While senators weighed strategy and admirals raced across the waves, the burden of Lilybaeum and the First Punic War pressed heaviest on ordinary men and women. Romans in their farmhouses far from Sicily, Carthaginian merchants watching their profits burn, Sicilian civilians enduring occupation, and mercenaries gambling their loyalty against the promise of coin. Consider first the Roman citizen soldier. By tradition, Rome's armies were levies of farmers. Each spring, men laid down plows to pick up shields, expecting to fight a season, win or lose, and then return home to tend their family's land. But Sicily was different. Campaigns stretched not months but years. The Siege of Lilybaeum itself dragged on so long that young recruits grew old in its shadow. Farms withered without sons to plow them. Wives and children struggled to maintain households with dwindling labor. The war thus bred economic imbalances. Wealthier landowners, able to employ slaves or tenants to keep fields productive, grew richer, while smallholders collapsed under absence. Over time, such shifts created a class of elites, expanding estates at the expense of ruined farmers, seeds of the vast latifundia system Rome became notorious for. And yet the soldiers endured because their service was bound up in civic identity. To fight for the Republic was to secure the honor of family and fatherland. Dying at Lilybaeum was not seen as meaningless attrition, but as a kind of tragic contribution to the collective survival of Rome. This cultural weight of duty, instilled by rituals, civic festivals, and constant political rhetoric, enabled Rome to ask sacrifice after sacrifice of its men without immediate collapse. Few other states could have survived losses on such a scale. For those same men, daily life in Sicily was no heroic epic, but routine misery. Siege warfare demanded labor as much as combat. Legionaries hauled timbers for siege towers, dug endless trenches under the Sicilian sun, and stood drenched in salt spray while guarding supply ships. They rationed grain carefully, mixed barley with whatever they could scavenge, and lived in tents amid swarms of disease. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. Soldiers far from home, year after year, watching comrades waste away, not in glorious charges, but in fever or dysentery. Archaeological digs near Lilybaeum reveal mass graves, skeletons of young males, laid side by side, many reduced by malnutrition as well as battle wounds. The silence of these graves conveys more than any rhetorical flourish. The war consumed a generation, not with a sudden blaze, but with slow, grinding attrition. Carthaginian. Soldiers faced their own struggles, but of a very different character. Most of them were mercenaries, Iberians, Celts, Numidians, Ligurians. They fought fiercely, but their bonds of loyalty tied not to civic duty, but to silver. Life for them was a cycle of boredom, occasional raids, and the constant anxiety of pay. When wages fell behind, discipline disintegrated. Mercenaries began selling rations, extorting locals, even plotting desertions. Stories circulate of drunk Celts brawling in Lilybaeum's alleys, of Iberian swords clashing with African shields in riots inside the walls. For them, the siege was as much test of patience as of courage. And when the war ended, frustration overflowed into the infamous mercenary war back in Carthage, where thousands of unpaid veterans turned on their former masters. Lilybaeum may not have sparked those flames, but the long tension in its garrison provided the sparks. For civilians, in Sicily the war was no chess match but a nightmare. Greek city-states scattered across the island found themselves forced to change allegiance like garments. One season Rome appeared ascendant, another Carthage. To survive, local elites shifted sides, bargaining with whichever overlord promised easier tribute. Meanwhile, ordinary peasants endured repeated requisitions. Crops were seized, barns emptied to feed whichever army occupied them, orchards trampled as soldiers foraged, livelihoods collapsed. Some towns were enslaved when they chose the wrong master at the wrong moment. Sicily, famed for its fertility, became instead a land of destitution and suspicion. This suffering altered culture itself. A generation of Sicilians grew up knowing no reality beyond war. Their art, their stories, their festivals bore scars of trauma. Even after Rome converted the island into its first province, memories of siege and famine lingered. Across villages, ruins of burnt farmhouses and hastily abandoned homesteads told silent stories passed down through families long after. Religion, too, was reshaped. In Rome, the disasters at sea, especially Drepana, deepened a devotion already ingrained in society. Pulcher's ridicule of omens had convinced the Senate that piety and power could not be separated. Rituals multiplied. Festivals to Neptune, long minor, gained new weight as Romans begged the sea god's favor. Temples rose with inscriptions memorializing fleets lost as sacrifices to divine caprice. In Sicily, soldiers carved dedications in local sanctuaries, mingling Roman deities with Greek and Punic gods. War thus bound cultures together as much through desperation as conquest. Carthage, already deeply religious in its own traditions, faced its own crises. Its oligarchs prayed to Baal Hammon and Tanit for victory, sacrificing lavishly after successes. Roman propaganda accused them of dreadful rites, even child sacrifice, though scholars debate how rooted these stories were in truth versus Roman attempts to paint their enemies as inhuman. Regardless, in the cultural imagination of Rome, such accusations justified ruthless campaigns. To defeat an enemy who sacrificed children was framed as not only political necessity but divine justice. Thus warfare hardened stereotypes that persisted generations later, shaping how enemies became demonized in rhetoric and memory. Daily life on the seas proved another crucible. Roman sailors were rarely professional. Many were landmen pressed into rowing duty. Imagine a farmer from Latium stationed at an oar, hands blistered, eyes stinging with salt. Rowing 12 hours at a stretch, fighting nausea in storms. This was service he never trained for. Carthaginian crews, by contrast, had grown with the sea, deftly maneuvering vessels as extensions of their bodies. Yet even they suffered privations. Naval provisions were monotonous: salted fish, barley cake, sour wine rationed cautiously. In both navies, disease spread easily on crowded vessels, where cramped conditions bred pestilence. To be a sailor in the First Punic War was to live perpetually on the edge of death by storm or ram. Slaves, too, felt the weight of war. Raiders captured entire communities in Sicily to be sold in Roman or Carthaginian markets. Once incorporated into households or chained to estates, their presence forever altered the demographic balance. Rome's victory in Sicily opened a vast influx of Sicilian slaves. A precedent followed later with Spanish and Eastern conquests. These slaves created new tensions in Italian life, undermining the economic role of free peasants. What began at Lilybaeum as a wartime necessity spiraled into centuries of structural change, a dependence on slave agriculture that would fuel both Rome's prosperity and its eventual social crises. Leadership's daily life was hardly glamorous either. Roman consuls carried massive responsibility during 12-month terms. They lived surrounded by soldiers demanding rations they often could not deliver, and letters from the Senate demanding victory with resources inadequate to secure it. The pressure to achieve personal glory while avoiding catastrophic disgrace was immense. No wonder some, like Pulcher, gambled foolishly. Carthaginian commanders, meanwhile, faced suspicion from councils at home. If they succeeded, they risked jealousy. If they failed, they faced recall and disgrace. Rarely did either side's men of command know peace of mind, and through all this, culture adapted. Romans began composing stories of endurance, families, memorialized lost fathers and brothers as martyrs of the Republic. Funerary inscriptions proudly recorded service in Sicily, even if campaigns ended in disaster. Patriotism was cemented not by victory alone, but by survival. For Carthage, the war instilled cynicism. Merchants spoke of the drain on silver. Citizens began questioning whether Sicily was worth the agony, creating divisions sharp enough to weaken their strategic resolve. Culture hardened into resignation rather than inspiration. So in the daily lives of those who lived through it, soldiers toiling at siege towers, sailors gasping in storms, families watching farms collapse, slaves carried to new fates, the war at Lilybaeum carved scars deeper than walls or fleets. One society turned those scars into fuel for greater ambition. The other let them fester into doubt. Rome and Carthage fought not only for an island but for the imaginations and endurance of their people. And in that war of culture and daily struggle, Rome proved the stronger. What survives after 23 years of blood, storms, and stalemate? Rome and Carthage both endured the Siege of Lilybaeum and the disasters of Drepana. Yet the outcome transformed one city into an empire and began the long decline of the other. This final act was not measured in walls breached or harbors blockaded, but in resilience, strategy, and the shaping of identity. For Rome, Lilybaeum confirmed that survival itself could be a form of victory. They lost fleets, armies, and entire generations of men, yet they refused to surrender. When fortune drowned their navy, they built another. When their enemies slipped through blockades, they dug in deeper. When their consuls disgraced themselves, they replaced them, but never abandoned the war. Slowly, inexorably, they demonstrated that the Republic was not simply a state, it was a culture of endurance. That lesson was absorbed into the Roman imagination, becoming a defining myth that Rome could withstand any disaster, provided its citizens held together. For Carthage, the consequences were subtler but devastating. At Lilybaeum, they proved again their mastery of seamanship, their brilliance in daring evacuation and resupply, their ability to strike Roman fleets with audacity. They won glory at Drepana. But glory did not convert into strategic victory. Their oligarchic council hesitated to fully invest. Their reliance on mercenaries bred instability, their politics fractured between caution and aggression. In their greatest hour of battlefield triumph, Carthage failed to exploit Rome's weakness. And in wars of attrition, a failure to annihilate is itself the seed of defeat. The long war that centered on Lilybaeum produced ripples across history. Rome's conquest of Sicily was more than territorial expansion. It inaugurated the creation of provinces, the imposition of governors, the systematic extraction of grain to feed Roman citizens. It marked the moment when Rome ceased to be a purely Italian power and became an imperial one. Everything that followed, Spain, Africa, Greece, Egypt, depends on this first step. The Republic might have returned home humbled by defeats at sea, stripped of treasure, and content to remain behind Apennine hills. Instead, it claimed Sicily, learned to command waves, and marched forward to dominate the Mediterranean. The war reshaped cultural imagination. To Roman families, memorials for sons lost in Sicily became emblems of civic pride. To the Senate, perseverance in such an ordeal justified further expansion. To Carthaginian citizens, however, the same war produced bitterness. Mercenary revolts erupted almost immediately afterward, a civil war within Carthage itself, fueled by unpaid soldiers embittered by the endless demands of Sicily. One society internalized the ordeal as strength, the other fractured under its weight. The modern relevance of Lilybaeum is striking. It shows that war is rarely decided by single battles. Tactical brilliance and sudden victories matter little, if not paired with political will. Carthage demonstrated the former time and again. Rome embodied the latter. The lesson resounds today. In struggles of attrition, resilience often outweighs skill. The state that accepts losses without losing faith in its cause will, over time, overcome one stronger in arms, but weaker in unity. It also illuminates the danger of arrogance. Pulcher's chickens, a story almost too absurd to be history, symbolize the peril of individual ambition and the dismissal of collective tradition. His jest cost Rome a fleet. But the Republic as a whole learned from it, deepening its piety and binding politics ever more tightly to religious ritual. Rome thus turned disgrace into renewal. Arrogance punished, humility harnessed. This was part of their genius. And finally, Lilybaeum reminds us of the human cost hidden behind grand narratives. The rams dredged from Sicilian waters today gleam in museums, but each represents empty places at a family's table 2 millennia past. Each grave near the city's walls marks a father, son, or friend lost not in a climactic charge, but in routine, exhaustion. Modern states too must reckon not only with whether wars can be endured economically or strategically, but whether the social fabric can bear decades of sacrifice. Rome's citizens believed it could. Most societies cannot. So what remains is this paradox. Lilybaeum was not decisive in itself. The city never fell during the war, nor did Carthage defeat Rome outright. And yet it was decisive precisely because it revealed which side could endure. The island fortress became a crucible, testing the essence of two civilizations. Carthage brilliant but brittle, Rome clumsy but unbreakable. From that crucible, the Roman Empire began. Think of the sequence. A landlocked republic built a fleet. From scratch, copied the technology of its enemies, invented new weapons, survived storm after storm, endured humiliation, and yet emerged stronger. Few stories better illustrate Rome's place in history. It is one thing to win. It is another to refuse defeat when all appears lost. The unanswered questions continue to fascinate. Could Carthage have ended the war after Drepana by pressing harder, by granting Hamilcar the resources he demanded? Could Rome have truly collapsed under one more catastrophe at sea? Did Hannibal, watching from his father's knee, interpret Lilybaeum as the caution to strike relentlessly at Rome, or as an impossible riddle to be solved only by genius? We cannot know with certainty. History chose its path. But these questions ensure that Lilybaeum is not merely dusty history, but a living puzzle about courage, endurance, and the choices states make in crises. And so we leave Sicily's western shore with a final thought. Rome did not conquer Carthage at Lilybaeum, but it proved something more important, that it could never be frightened off an ambition once chosen. Against storms, against hunger, against defeat and disgrace, the Republic endured. It was that endurance, more than all its weapons or walls, that shattered Carthage's navy and built the first stones of an empire that would one day stretch from Britain to the deserts of Syria.